We used to visit him at the set all the time, at the studios when he was making the movie. And, you know, your father's job is your father's job. And you then, after 4 years, we then saw the movie, and it was in this incredible cinema, and we were all dressed up, and this film just overwhelmed us, and it was fantastic. And I just thought I had the coolest dad of anybody in my class.
I lived in New York when Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick started putting this story together. And the key thing is they didn't have a script, they didn't have a story. What they wanted to express is something they didn't know themselves, but which had to exist. But they succeeded, and it was called first The Sentinel, and then A Journey Beyond the Stars, and the title 2001: A Space Odyssey came much later. And when I saw finally the finished film, yes, I was most impressed by the fact that a great artist like Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, both agnostics, take a bow to the unknowable.
But during the past few weeks, I've wondered whether you might be having some second thoughts about the mission.
How do you mean? I was doing a film in London with Laurence Olivier. At the end of shooting one day, I came home and my wife said, "Call your agent." So I called my agent and he said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "No, why?" He says, "You better sit down." I said, "Why?" He said, "You've just been offered the lead in Stanley Kubrick's next film." I couldn't believe it, because I knew nothing about being considered. By that time, I'd seen Spartacus, I'd seen The Killing, I'd seen Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, and I knew I was being offered to work with one of the greatest film directors in the world. Stanley was so calm. He never raised his voice. You knew you were in the presence of genius, without question. I loved every minute of working with him.
Self-criticism was a very, very important part. He was not fast, because he was careful and always questioned himself.
I also think you need a strong measure of self-belief and love of what you're doing, because otherwise it will be a half creative piece of work. People will see it'll be fraudulent.
He had to be in love with an idea. And I mean in love, not like it. Like it is too weak. Once he had made up his mind, he was like a woman in labor. Then there was no coming, then you go. Yeah? But before that, he was very, very, very careful. Yeah. All his films, they have different genres, but they all deal with our frailty, with humanity and humanity's failures. His focus was always on our vanity, our frailty, and he was convinced that the way we behave, humanity has no chance to survive, because we are not governed by our intellect, by our knowledge. We are governed by our emotion. And he wouldn't exclude himself.
I also think that Stanley's films did have a style going throughout his 13 films. And Martin Scorsese very sweetly said that you were a filmmaker, you waited for the next Stanley Kubrick film.
We had to wait for a Kubrick film. And we knew that when we went to see it, that it was extremely special and that we expected a lot from it, quite honestly. And in 2001, we got it.
First day of shooting, we were ready, and Stanley looked down and looked at our shoes. He didn't like them, so we didn't shoot that day. He said, "We've got to get different shoes," so we didn't shoot. And that was our first day of shooting, which indicated he had an eye for perfection. He was truly a perfectionist. You just sensed through every portion of your body that you were dealing with an extremely talented genius. To be in that presence was a very special experience. But he was very everyday. I mean, he was open to suggestions. He never made you feel stupid for suggesting something. I'll give you an example. One of the climactic scenes is when Hal is reading our lips in the pod. That was a suggestion made by Gary Lockwood, who played the other astronaut. He came up with that idea, and Stanley loved it. That was one of the few that we suggested.
I've got a bad feeling about him.
You do?
Yeah. definitely.
We had a lot of discussions. I was there early for makeup tests, costume fitting, alongside Gary Lockwood, who played the other astronaut. So we discussed the fact of what their personas would be like, and that the astronauts would have been chosen for their psychological profiles, the fact that emotionally would take something unbelievable to make them very upset, that there would be very calm people in terrible circumstances.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
That's perhaps why people have commented that the astronauts were more machine-like than the voice of Hal. Well, that was just because when you begin to see our characters for the first time in the film, we have been in space for months, and there's nothing new to say. We've said it all. So all there is the daily routine, which is exactly the same day in, day out, until Hal creates problems.
It wasn't a movie. It was the first time that the motion picture form had been changed. It wasn't a documentary, and it wasn't a drama, and it wasn't really science fiction. It was more science eventuality.
I talked to Arthur C. Clarke before he died. Unfortunately, it was about 15, 16 years ago in Sri Lanka. And I told him, Arthur, 35 years ago, I was sitting at the table and you and Stanley developed this story. And, you know, I was totally flabbergasted about these billions of stars and billions of what have you. To me, it sounded like there are stars and planets and moons like grains of sand by the sea. And he looked at me and said, not enough sand. It is formed by two people who were totally in love with wanting to show an audience there is more than we understand. And there has to be more.
Otherwise, this is very lonely if we're the only somethings in all of that.
Yeah.
I don't think that we are alone, thank goodness.
Just before the scene where my character's in that strange room, he takes a journey through time and space. It's lots of strange lights and vistas and very weird. Everything you see in this film was shot in reality. There's no computer-generated special effects. All I had to do was, I was on a platform with a big camera here, sometimes just doing my eye, other times doing a big close-up where I had to react using my imagination. So Stanley did what they often used to do in silent films. He played music. The Antarctica Suite by Vaughan Williams. I'm asked this a great deal about what does the film mean? What is the meaning?
It's a repeat of the beginning. You know, in the beginning, the apes see the monolith. The monolith is like a track going through the film. And at the end, it's exactly the same thing again. It's an expression of, I don't know, but there has to be.
I will paraphrase Stanley Kubrick. How do you explain a Beethoven symphony? You can't. It's impossible. 2001 is a visual symphony. And the perfect example is that in one of the premieres, one of the first showings, there was a nun who expressed the fact that this was one of the most religious experiences that she ever had. And in 2001, they arranged for the Pope, who showed it to a lot of cardinals. And yet we have atheists who think this film is a genius film. So there is no one explanation. It's a symphony.